We're now going to go into the panel discussion. Catalina, Anna, Gerald, which we're going to do together with Antonio Cataldo, my colleague at OCA, and myself. Thank you. I'd like to kick off with the concept that actually Catalina brought onto the table, which is the question of extreme essentialism. It made me think, well, an authenticity within that. And it made me think straight away of something that the Indian theorist Gayatri Spivak talks about, which is actually strategic essentialism. So there is perhaps here a dichotomy of positions. Catalina, if I understood you rightly, in extreme essentialism, there is a fear of a preconceived sense of authenticity, of not allowing enough diversity or complexity within the authentic. For Spivak, the question of strategic essentialism connects more with perhaps what Gerald was talking about at some point, institutionally speaking, that you have to have a sort of positive selection process in a way to make sure that there are, for example, in the case of institutions, indigenous curatorial voices. You have to actually, positively go out and do it to force through that diversification. So I wanted to ask you, Catalina, how do you see those two poles operating within the experience of indigenous discourse?
I think I would like to nuance that to say when I spoke about essentialism and authenticity, I was referring to the judgment of non-indigenous people towards indigenous art, which I think is something that I probably didn't explain myself enough, but I was referring to the fact that in the sort of museum narratives, indigenous art is expected to look in some way or another. There is a preconception of what indigenous art is that comes from non-indigenous curators or non-indigenous directors. So I think that leads to saying that I do believe there should be, as you were saying, a positive selection of an institutional position towards a positive selection of indigenous curators and of the inclusion of indigenous narratives within the narratives of the museums. I think in the case of Canada, as I was hearing, this has happened much more successfully than in Latin America, where I don't think there isn't even the kind of political will to make this happen. And I think in most cases institutional structures are very problematic in terms of how they work in relation to larger politics. So let's say I don't see it as a dichotomy. I see it more as a two ways of referring to the term, but I wasn't referring to essentialism. I was referring to essentialism from outside, not from like strategically using it. But yeah, I think as I was listening to the presentations, I realized how much probably in Latin America is the grassroots that are really probably pushing this forward more than more established institutions that are so far have been incapable of kind of integrating those narratives into their programs.
And certainly, from my perspective, in Norway we have a real problem when it comes to that strategic essentialism or that presence within the institutional fabric. It certainly seems after Gerald's presentation that we are absolutely 30 years behind on that. I'd like to hand over to Antonio. Perhaps you'd like to ask the next question.
Yeah, because I was very curious canon, but also because it was a very interesting run through of buildings and of museums as an architectural space, which so heavily is presented against the artist. And then what's very curious, because I had, gone through some of your writings from the 90s, for instance, and when you spoke about the art as a site of struggle, and where there was also this dichotomy where artists were playing against the museum somehow. They were positioning themselves within the museum, but being outside of the museum, and in a very specific moment of the contestation. And I wonder how that struggle is present or visible nowadays in this kind of in the space of the museum. I mean, because you have mentioned very little about your work as well, and how you also started during the 90s in a very heavy moment, in a very heavy political moment somehow, which was heavily connected to what was going on within the country. So yeah, I'm very curious about this. Yeah.
1917, the 100th anniversary celebrated just a few weeks ago of in Canada called Vimy. And Vimy is a place in France, in northern France, in which the Canadian Armed Forces, where a lot of Canadians lost lives, in a very strategic push to win the battle, an important battle in France. And so it's been touted as an extremely important battle. During that time, there were a lot of indigenous soldiers as part of that who died and are buried in Vimy. And the Second World War, the same thing. Indigenous soldiers volunteered, that we weren't conscripted into the armed forces. We volunteered because a lot of the soldiers, particularly men, women were involved in other strategic contributions during the war, but the men and women wanted to get off the reservation. It was during this time, from the 1876 to 1952, when the laws in Canada forbade so many aspects of cultural, it was a cultural genocide. And so life in these reservations were so stark, so severe, that they just escaped, so they joined the army. I guess what I say that is because after the return from the Second World War, the men began to collectively get together to address these issues. They started organizing political bodies, the first time across Canada, and this was just right after the war. And through the 50s and 60s, I felt we were born out of what was going on in the United States with the civil rights movement and then eventually the women's rights movement. But indigenous people, certainly in our country, have been responding in very political ways. It wasn't until the 70s that the arts community, indigenous arts community, began to do the same thing. We had to do something. Our art was bad, but we had a loud voice, That's what we discovered later, We thought we were really good artists, but we weren't. We were just young. We were full of, as we would say, piss and vinegar, But we felt that some stridency was needed in order to kickstart institutions, And much like the soldiers had done, the civil rights and women's movement in the United States really pushed that envelope forward. The indigenous arts community in Canada began to do the same thing. And I think that it really woke up the institutions in Canada, although it took another 20 years, I think, for it to change. And I think it was significant that the artists needed to do that, and they needed to start from the grassroots level. So now the after effects are, as I pointed out in my presentation, Also in our Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, which is a national body, funding body for artists in all genres, as well all the provincial governments, all the provincial arts councils, they are all now targeting Indigenous arts in so many ways. It's absolutely, when we think what was going on in the 70s and 80s, nothing, to what's going on now, the strategic advancements that have been made, I think, in the arts community is a result, I think, of a lot of the efforts on the part of artists, And so while we're still doing our art, trying to become artists, while also thinking about who we were, the kind of that differentiating ourselves with the rest of the Canadian artistic community, trying to understand who we were. Well, what is that political voice that we were trying to establish, and what were we fighting? Well, we were fighting authority, and I think that through the fighting authority, we also gained some kind of, in an interesting kind of way, we gained some kind of authority ourselves, because we realized we had to take something back. We had given up so much, and we had to take something back. We had to control. We had to have the authority over our voice, and I think that's why we were so strident the way we were. And then we realized that we had to target other institutions, and I think the art institution was the most difficult nut to crack. We had to continue to fight the art, and I think by this time the art was getting better. And so, you just look around the room, and the artists that are in this room, they're amazing artists. But it took a while. It took a few generations to get that moving. And I think the art world then started to realize that, hey, there's some really great art by individuals who happen to be Indigenous. And I think that was the discourse of the day. So now artists are saying, well, I'm Indigenous. I don't have to apologize for it. When at one time I think we had to apologize for it. But now, hey, I think that the idea of a very, it's no longer the kind of stridency that artists were, because their art is so powerful. And I think the kind of attention given to the ways in which artists are presenting themselves in the kind of works is really quite remarkable, because I didn't talk any more than just about Canada, but what's going on in the United States is equally as powerful. Artists are going all over the world these days, not celebrating, but participating in international exhibitions, biennales or whatever, Documenta, as I said earlier, and then exhibitions are also traveling. So I think that that move to push institutions in the right direction took some time. It just didn't happen overnight. And I think that we did it in different ways, and we didn't all do it together, because it was happening sometimes located in Vancouver or Edmonton or some of those cities I was talking about. They're always located, but on a whole. And then, of course, in the north, in the Arctic, which was quite remarkable, when you have nobody, really, the artists weren't pushing. It was the outsiders, the people in the south, that were pushing for Inuit art. And they had a different historical trajectory than in the southern part where the Indigenous artists are. But I think now with the idea that what was happening with the artists in Canada, what's happening with artists in the United States, what we're finding now, and what you were talking about, what's going on in Latin America, and then later we're going to hear Jonathan Jones from Australia, you have what's an interesting kind of a global connectivity, a global, it's not a global indigeneity, because we haven't yet to define what that is, but a kind of a global connectivity amongst indigenous creators, which is creating another kind of level of discourse that we're just starting to understand. That we're just starting to get into that, scratch that surface. But artists are so supremely aware of each other, what's going on. But it had to start so local and almost at a political level. But now the politics is still there. The politics is quite local, but yet I think the impact is so international now.
I want to pick it up from there, actually, and ask a question to Anna. You spoke about where does tradition live in the digital age, and what if cyberspace was indigenous? And then you ended by commenting that perhaps cyberspace is not a museum place. And Gerald, you were also just talking about the large international presence of so many indigenous artists today. So, and I also want to think about and just remember the fact that somehow there seem to be some parallels here. When I think of Afrofuturism, so many of those artists claimed the future to be black, for example. So it does seem as if, the non-canonical experiences need to also find these non-normative spaces in which to grow and flourish. So from that perspective, and if we go back to the question of museums and fire, perhaps you might want to talk about that in a way to sort of wrap up some of the ideas. If cyberspace is indigenous, if it were indigenous, and since it is a borderless place, and since it allows all this three-dimensionality and orality and non-textuality that you talk of, what could all those conditions do within this framework of museums and fire?
That's a good question. Thanks, Katya. And probably you'll comment after too, Gerald. The frustration with museums, in my experience, is that they really operate within a capitalist economy, right, and with a nation-state economy. I think everybody's said that. The question then, can you ever escape it? Are there micro networks, micro economies? What's the potential for an indigenous worldview to operate in parallel, let's say? And in that regard, I mean, the internet isn't completely different than a museum. I mean, it's not bricks and mortar, but it doesn't have the same overhead. But you struggle on the internet for visibility. You can get submerged really quickly. There are privileged internet highways. So there's still an element of how to create an infrastructure. Both suffer from the question of infrastructure or systemic, as you mentioned, Gerald, systemic racisms or disenfranchisements. And Oluoguibe talked a lot about disconnectivity. And in some circles, or from some perspectives, the idea of Inuit not being fully embraced is perhaps an advantage. And I suppose that argument somehow parallels the idea of reservations being a positive or something, it's a funny twist, isn't it? But I think I don't think our technological appreciation is I think there's much to learn. So I would say that it is at a research moment that's very promising. That's a goal of mine on a grant anyway, and going for another one, trying to bring people together to think through this problem very specifically, that this is a think tank issue going forward. What is this potential exactly to achieve? I suppose that's a final achievement of alterity. But there we go. Do you want to comment, Gerald?
Well, I just want to say that an indigenous community is not an indigenous community, but there are communities. And within that, there's also, there's the art community, there's a music community, there's a powwow community. People use the internet and the internet in their own way and take it upon themselves to really define it in its own way as well. Not that anybody is pushed out of it, but I think it does exist, And it's interesting, you just have to go look around and realize, my God, this is happening there. And it's so exciting that particularly amongst young people, I mean, us old people are still trying to deal with everything, we still have a past to consider. But the young people are terribly engaged, in all of that. And I think it's really exciting to see what's going on. And I was thinking we were up in the north. I was up in the north up in the Arctic, and you were talking about it just a moment ago about the bandwidth and how concern about trying. We talk about connecting with the Arctic and with the north, and they want to be connected with the south because they are with it. They understand what's going on. But the speed of access is so slow that it's going to take years before high-speed internet makes it to the north. It's not that they don't have access to high-speed internet. It's just that the bandwidth is allocated in a particular interesting way because the security of the country, the RCMP, needs its own bandwidth and is pretty wide. And then the hospitals have a really equally huge bandwidth. And then as you go further down, then the everyday people have this very, very little narrow line, that is so slow that they're so frustrated. That's all the communities, But I think they're looking to connect to everybody. And I think that's really exciting. Indigenous peoples, when we think of indigeneity, it's not just sitting in a particular space, physical space, but it's a cyberspace that they're located in, where you can be indigenous, but and to make it an indigenous space in its own way, and then define it in its own way, but also to be part of the larger world. Nobody wants to be left out. Nobody wants to be left behind. And indigenous peoples are the same. You can still be indigenous, but yet, be with everybody. So what is indigeneity? It's not what you look like, but it's really who you are in many ways, And I think that's a critical area that I think indigenous peoples are really engaged in right now. And the conversation is really quite exciting.
Thanks, Gerald. I just wanted to quickly add that it is a question of voice. So given the amount of ignorance in particular about what it's like in the Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic, giving residents there the chance to be heard, to express their point of view, express their talent, whatever that is, it seems paramount.
And perhaps now we could open up to all of you. Does anybody have a comment, a question?
Thank you to all of you. I have a question. If we look at the global situation of planet Earth and grassroots movements like Idle No More, what's happening in the 80s with Alta case, what's happening with the windmill case in Fosen in South Trøndelag, which is a South Sami area right now, the parallel sort of depletion of the earth, both water and sky, and then museums on fire, and we are talking about the systematic. I would like to ask, how can we learn from, also in the way we engage in the art world, or whether it's inside an institution or grassroots or parallel? How do we also parallelly deal with these questions? Because like the opening here with Sunna talking about his community and his family and being in X amount of court cases, parallel with being an artist or parallel with trying to survive. These kind of questions where we move and what, for instance, broadband means in an ecological sense. All these I'm just wondering if you have some thoughts on that. I have no specific question, just some kind of feeling of something that we have maybe not directly addressed, because maybe it will be addressed secondly. I don't know. Always, in a way, this kind of perspective of the global. What does the global mean for our collective also existence?
I'll only quickly acknowledge your point that every cell phone has an enormous carbon footprint, but there are many smartphones and various devices already in the Arctic. I guess that's another question of research before us to find a way. Fiber won't be laid down anytime soon. That would be too difficult and too ecologically destructive.
I wanted to say, when I was talking about Calpulite Calco, the organization that Fernando Palma runs with his family, I wanted to point at a type of grassroots organization that I think, what I think is that this has to be taken to other levels of management. Let's talk about it in those terms. And I think it'd be great if this grassroots organization become an example for bigger institutions, for the functioning of bigger structures, because then you can kind of break down the implications of these types of organization. And I think that can affect things at an epistemological level, if you want. If we start doing things differently, then we're going to reach another type of knowledge production that is much needed, I think. So I think what Duane was telling me about taking over this organization for a year and programming it for a year, I think if more of that happened in different levels, then I think looking at a global perspective, we wouldn't be looking at global capitalism, but maybe at a global grassroots connectivity that I think it's much more viable and sustainable. However, what you say about sort of ecological concerns, I think we are all implicated in this production of gadgets that are not sustainable. So we also need to think through that. And I think also at a grassroots level, I'm sure there are things happening that we are not aware of. So I think we just need to pay more attention to that.
You brought up Idle No More, and which was a movement about 10 years ago, I think, in the last 10 years, started in Canada, and really made a lot of push and a lot of press was made of it, which was very good. And I was thinking of Idle No More and other movements like that are grassroots, are an attempt to push back at something. And usually, whether it's institutional pushback or what have you, what I found, what I get out of that, and the area in which we address all the time is art. I have to take it back to the art, because I think what happens, Idle No More and some of the others, like in the United States currently, the Standing Rock Sioux, that movement in South Dakota which is preventing the pipelines from going through Indian country. The pushback from that, and I wasn't sure about Idle No More, but possibly true, but art has had a way to respond to it as well. Or art has been a way in which you could use it to any advantage to think about that. And I'm thinking about art as being always used that way. You know, artists have always been engaged politically in different ways to express what's going around, and I think what's happening with indigenous peoples. But for us, it seems like the whole idea is not new. And I was thinking also in the 19th century, in which warrior artists were creating art as a response to the incursion of settlers coming in, as well as armies coming in. And it was a response to that by creating drawings in little books like this, and showing the kinds of interactions, bloody interactions, if you will, about that relationship. So it was always about these kind of relationships of indigenous peoples to non-indigenous peoples, for example. And I think that's Idle No More continues along that lines. But what's interesting, my presentation, I spoke about the truth and reconciliation, in which we're thinking now, how do we reconcile that kind of relationship? And I think, to me, what's critically important are the questions when I come back to the art, is what happens when creative cultures come in contact with each other, okay? And I'm thinking, well, art happens, you know, and in really important ways, whether it's about politicized kind of art expressions or their other kinds of expressions. I think that the idea of coming together in the art world is quite different than, say, in a very highly politicized, other kinds of dangerous worlds. But the arts community tends to address a meeting, a reconciling, a meeting in a particular space in very interesting and creative ways, you know. So I think that the idea of when we're looking at organizations and movements and revolutionary movements like that, art can be so important at that time. And I think that we're just starting to discover once again with Isle No More or other situations happening in indigenous communities, how critical that is, you know. But the story's not new, and I think that's what I'm trying, one of the points I want to make about that it is 100 years old or more, you know, I think, but we can analyze it differently. But to me, I think that the critical point is how artists have been engaged as well, not just shouting, but using their art in very powerful ways.
Is there any other question, or we've got a question back there?
Hello. Hi. I just more have a response, series of responses. First, to say that the current condition of being an Indigenous artist, particularly in Canada, and making exhibitions in the institutions that you mentioned, I think it's important for me to say, as someone who's been making exhibitions for the past 5 or 6 years in and around these institutions, that it's not easy. And I want to just mention, for example, one particular institution that you talked about, the power plant. If you go on the website and you look through their archive and you count the number of Indigenous artists that have had solo exhibitions in the past 25 years, you can count it on your one hand, literally. And so that makes me think about the conditions of inclusivity and inclusion that these institutions have done over the past 10 years in particular. So they make these positions of Indigenous curator within the institution. So they're setting forth a prescriptive condition for these Indigenous curators or artists or artworks to be in. And that's the position that I'm talking about, that it's not easy to be in that position when you're included into a prescriptive condition, which was meant to exclude you, right? That's the structure, is meant to exclude myself, and more specifically in Canada and the United States, Indigenous women artists who have very, very few, if at all, solo exhibitions. You mentioned one of them, late Annie Putuguk, of course, but after that...
Faye Heavy Shield.
Faye Heavy Shield, and right now Maria Hupfield at the power plant. And so they're very, very far and very, very few. And this is deliberate. I'm just going to say it. It's a deliberate exclusion by these institutions that you mentioned, Gerald, to exclude Indigenous women artists and Indigenous men, Indigenous queer artists, Indigenous trans artists as well. And so these are the conditions that we enter into as artists, into these systems. And again, it's not easy. It's worth saying again and again. Another response I have is to you, Anna. You mentioned at the beginning of your that you would much rather have an Inuit person in your position, but you don't, and you proceeded anyways, and you're here. Mm-hmm. To me, that's a huge problem. I can't be here and not say that to you in this context. So I have to say that it's a problem to me, right? I'm not Inuit, I'm a Cree person, but I value personally the forms and ideas of Inuit people. And so I have to say that in this context to let you know that it's a problem that you're speaking in the way that you do. That's what I have to say.
Duane, I agree with you about the power plant, and hopefully things will change. I am on the board of the power plant just of this year, so I hope that is a sign for the future. The director of the power plant is Black Canadian, which is also maybe another sign. But, I think you are right. I think there are certain kinds of Canadian art institutions that are still very resistant to that. And most, obviously, it's the contemporary art spaces. I think the traditional art spaces, yeah.
I think in particular the National Gallery, like their first, and you know this, I'm repeating this because it's worth repeating, is the first contemporary indigenous art they collected was Carl Beam in 1989. Like, that was not that long ago, right? This kind of exclusion, again, is systematic and problematic, right? And it wishes to continue, it wishes to sort of replicate itself, that kind of behavior again and again and again. So I'm just really critical of these kinds of inclusions that we're allowed to be in, right? These systems that we're allowed to sort of come into. This me too. I'm very self-critical of making exhibitions in these spaces, for example, right? And it's self-reflective of asking myself, what have I implicated myself into, right? Because I'm in those collections too.
Exactly. The next. Yeah, I think there's still some. One of the great exclusions in a Canadian cultural institution is there's not one Indigenous person at a directorial level in Canada.
Thank you, Duane, for challenging me. I appreciate that. Of course, you should. And all I can say to you is that I see my role fundamentally as a facilitator. So perhaps the criticism is the context of this discussion that I'm a part of, but
You go further, but
well, hang on, you got to let me talk too, right? Is that there's only one woman in a woman who is the comparable, and Heather couldn't be here, right? So that's Heather Gloliorte, because she's the one person, she's in demand. Well, yeah.
But she's only one kind of Inuit art historian that could be here, that has a PhD. You don't have to have a PhD to do
No, you don't. You're right.
That's what you're suggesting. That's the problem.
No, you don't have to have a PhD, though. I agree with you fully, right? So, okay, so I get your point. I thank you for it. But in the context of this discussion, we could change the format of this completely too, right? Thank you.
I just wanted to add that I'm very conscious of, when I was preparing my presentation, that all the artists I showed were men, and realized what you're saying, there is a systematic exclusion of women artists and queer artists and trans artists. And I was actually very conscious and thinking, and I tried to contact Elvira Espejo many times, but we couldn't agree to meet on Skype one day to talk with her about all this, because I was really interested in getting her views on all this. But so I think you're right, and I think I appreciate that you brought it up. There is this second level of exclusion for women, indigenous artists in this system, and I just wanted to make sure you knew I was aware of that, because it bothers me that this keeps coming up as well.
One of the things I just point out, Duane, 25 years ago was the first time that a major institution brought together artists from across Canada, both Inuit, First Nations and Métis, where all the curators were Indigenous, and we said we didn't want any non-Indigenous people organized or involved in this exhibition. That was the point we made, and I think it was successful. That was 25 years ago. And then we said, okay, I think we've made our point, because up until now, what we had were ventriloquists. And I think that's the charge you're making right now. We said that, and that's the point that we tried to make, and that's the point we made. And we said, okay, now we've made the point, I think the world can go on. But I think that was the point we made, and we were successful. Yes, I think, and I'm not speaking on your behalf, mind you, but that was a similar situation, I think, with First Nations and other artists back in the early 90s, is because we had other voices speaking on our behalf. It was our time and our place. We spoke for ourselves, and that was quite successful. Now it's changed. I think that, yeah, there still has to be, there's still a lot of Inuit artists, but very few voices that are the intellectual voices for the art other than non-Inuit. And I think that that's a problem. And because a lot of folks from the north just are not coming south, I mean, we have to go north ourselves too. I agree. I think it's just things we have to change. We have to figure out ways in which we can train Inuit curators, young Inuit intellectuals. That has to change, you know. And we have to work with them as well. And if the First Nations community can influence that, I think that's a good thing, you know. I'm involved with Inuit myself as a First Nations person going up and working, but I agree. I think the danger is in ventriloquism. It can still be there, but at the same time, people are working together now. And I think that's the reconciliatory part of curatorial practice today.
So on that note, I think we have to finish it off for the moment so we can keep up a little bit with our schedule, because we are a little bit behind. But thank you very much. I'd like to offer a warm round of applause to our speakers and invite you for more coffee and snacks. Hello. Thanks for coming back for the last panel of the day. We're going to kick this off with artist and curator Jonathan Jones, who's worked for some years at the Art Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney, and who's well known for his evocative site-specific installations and interventions, which illuminate and bridge between cultures and the agencies of exchange. So please join me in welcoming Jonathan. Thank you.
Yamadu marang mujigalang, yun di Jonathan Jones, balado rajari bu gamilore bu gibibu, nati ninja mala main galang, narambangu sami main galang, ninja mala main galangu yinabu dayanlu. I'd also like to acknowledge the organisers for this event, for enabling me to speak here today. I'd also like to say that it's great to see some really familiar faces and some old friends who I haven't seen in a while. I'd like to obviously start by acknowledging Anders as well for this amazing space that we're sitting in. I think it's really helped the conversation as it's sort of definitely framed some ideas for me. And lastly, obviously, I'd like to thank you guys, the audience. I know it's the end of a big day, and we've had a lot of ideas thrown at us, so it's a little bit tiring. So it's fantastic, and I offer you all respect or yinjamara, and for listening and staying around. So as mentioned, I'm Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi. So they're two nations that are sort of within the southeast of Australia. The southeast is a region that I guess I'll be speaking about a lot through my talk. It's a region that sort of takes up about a quarter of the country. It's about 80 different nations, each with their own sort of law and language. And when I think of myself and where I come from and my family, I sort of think of my country. So my country is really sort of these vast rolling hills, grassy plains, beautiful sky, beautiful sky. And seasonal rivers. And this shot here is actually just the morning that I had to drive to the airport to come to be with you today. I guess I've just been thinking about everything that everyone said, and I guess it's worth sort of mentioning again that museums can be understood as these sort of crowning institutions of empire. They've colonised our possessions, they've colonised our knowledge, and they've colonised our bodies. They probably, they're highly politicised spaces, and I guess they're probably always going to be highly politicised spaces. And I guess what was interesting about some of the talks today, and this is what's great about being towards the end, is you can reflect a little bit on what everyone said, but one thing that I'm very aware of is that we're just one part of this story. We've sort of received this project of decolonising museums and unpacking this history from people before us. But I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we've got to hand it on. So what we do in terms of decolonising spaces is really important for the next generation and how we pass it on, just to kind of frame our role within, I guess, that trajectory. So the art project that I really want to talk to you today about is part of that decolonising process. The project was really aimed at waking up Aboriginal knowledge or Wiradjuri Kamilaroi knowledge, healing very old wounds and building on existing community aspirations. And it's a very specific talk, obviously, for a very specific story, but I really hope that there's probably some elements that might help inspire other groups in their decolonising projects. Before I should get too far into it all, I should also say that I'm enormously jet-lagged, and it's a very complex story, so I'm going to try and read my notes so I stay on track. But if something doesn't make sense, please call out. So in September last year, I was lucky enough to be invited to I was working with a group called Cataldo Public Art Projects, and I was invited to make a major artwork in Sydney. Cataldo Public Art Projects are a contemporary art foundation based in Australia who have spent the last 50 years bringing major international artists to Australia. And for instance, they've worked with people like Christo, Gilbert and George, Jeff Koons, Marina Abramovich, just to name a few. And I'd encourage you all to look at their website to see some of the extraordinary projects that John Cowdor, who's the sort of head of that organisation, has done. My project was the first time an Australian has ever been invited to work with the group, and so the first time that an Aboriginal person had ever taken on a project, which was enormously intimidating, as I'm sure you'll understand, but it was definitely an extraordinary opportunity to take Aboriginal stories to a new audience and to, I guess, a different platform. So for a number of reasons, I decided to look at Sydney's International Exhibition building of the 1800s, which was known as the Garden Palace. This was really the kind of catalyst for my project. The Garden Palace was built in 1879 to house Australia's first World Fair. It was over 250 metres long, 150 metres wide, had a major sort of dome in the centre, which was 30 metres in diameter and reached up to 65 metres in the sky, making it one of the largest domes in the Southern Hemisphere. And it was a huge engineering feat. It was positioned on a high ridgeline where the Botanic Gardens is today in the city, just off the city grid. The Garden Palace, like all international exhibitions, being part of that sort of imperial World Fair system, which we've already started to talk a little bit about today, was very much based on the Crystal Palace in London. Is very much entangled in that history of industry, empire building, displays, museumology, which, you know, as I said, we've already been starting to speak around some of those issues as the day's gone on. For Australia, however, the World Fair was more than a way of just announcing our produce and wealth and technology. It was really around this time that Australia was trying to promote itself as a place for people to settle and part of this new world. It came on the back of Australia's abolishment of convict ships coming. So Australia had just banned convicts and was really, the Garden Palace was really a marketing campaign to sell Australia. And with thanks to the gold rush in Australia, we were one of the richest countries in the world. This, along with the advent of steamships, which you can see here in the foreground of this image, and the completion of the Suez Canal in 1869 meant that we were no longer a sort of distant corner of the world, but we really became a viable market. The Garden Palace inside the Garden Palace, the hallways were overflowing with displays of both imported and manufactured goods. Everything from pianos to porcelain was sort of hastily acquired by middle and upper classes to demonstrate their status in a new world order. Like many other world fairs, the Garden Palace had a major ethnographic court, which displayed countless Aboriginal objects. These objects were predominantly from the southeast, as by the 1880s, the southeast region, the region of my family, was the area that had mainly been colonised. And in many ways, these collections represent the plunder of the violence on the frontier. Based on racial theories of the day and ethnographic displays like this were included in international exhibitions really as a way of benchmarking Western progress. It was really this story of looking at how simple Aboriginal communities were and how advanced Western technology, how advanced Western civilization was. When we look at the lists of objects that were on display, mainly men's material was shown alongside with ancestral remains, so skulls and body parts. We can see that women's material and children's material was mainly excluded. The notion of the savage and the concept that Aboriginal people occupied the lowest sort of rung on the evolutionary ladder, which we were soon to fall off anyway, was curated into existence through shows like this. However, this collection, as skewed as it was, came from the Australian Museum, which is the sort of major institution in Australia, so our oldest museum, along with private collections, and represented the most important body of work from the southeast region ever to be assembled. A region that, as you can imagine, had been completely devastated by colonialism, by colonisation, and most communities were unable to maintain these practices. So these objects were often not seen again. Things are starting to change now, of course. After the international exhibition left Sydney, the Garden Palace, which was this enormous exhibition centre, became Sydney's first cultural institution. So the Australian Museum moved all of its material into the building. The New South Wales Art Society, which was the proponent of the New South Wales Art Gallery, moved their collection in and established themselves in the building. Other museums like the Mineral Museum, the Technological Museum, all moved into this enormous building. In addition to that, it became Australia's first major concert hall with daily concerts and performances, while the basement of the building became the house of the Colonial Archives and Library, and in fact included Australia's first 2 censuses, and all our convict records were sort of housed in this building. So, in short, this extraordinary building became this enormous archive for all of Australia's history. And I should also mention at that time that Australia was also governing New Zealand. So all of the New Zealand material was also placed in this building as well. However, on September 22nd, 1882, so only 3 years after its opening, under unknown circumstances, the Garden Palace and all its contents was lost in an extraordinary fire, which only lasted 6 hours. So the entire building was completely levelled, taking with it countless cultural collections of unimaginable significance. Even today I get really upset when I look at this stuff. Strangely, the Garden Palace fire not only destroyed the physical material that was actually housed in the building, but it also strangely destroyed the memory of itself. And in many ways, this building, its story, has been completely forgotten in Sydney. You could ask, 100 people, and no one would be able to tell you the story. No one even knew this building existed. I only found out about this building when I was researching material from where my family was from. Went into the museum, like lots of people do, and I guess it's a feeling which never escapes me, is that when I go into museums, because of this history, I can't point at anything that's mine. Aboriginal culture is meant to be the world's oldest living culture. And yet I go into that museum and there's nothing that I identify with. And when you go in there, and I remember that day that they sat me down, an Aboriginal curator there sat me down and told over a coffee and told me the story of the Garden Palace, which was a really hard day. It wasn't a great day for me. It was like a punch in the guts, as you can imagine, when you realise that, in fact, I was part of a very wealthy cultural tradition. My ancestors did make beautiful things, but they were stockpiled and they were, destroyed in a massive bonfire. So how do you make an artwork out of this story? How do you tell this story and not continue the cultural trauma that is colonisation? I don't want to retell this story and be part of that process. And it definitely defies one of the key Wiradjuri principles that my elders tell me, which is Maralagala Dya, which is this idea, literally translated in hold on tight. So look after community. You've got to hold on to each other and take care of each other. And that has been the challenge for this project, and I think is the challenge that we're all facing. How do we move forward in such a colonial construct and not buy into it and actually move the conversation further? And I think that's the real issue that we're all facing here. So for me, I ended up talking with my Uncle Stan. Uncle Stan's a knowledge holder for language for our community. And I remember sitting down with him a number of years ago telling him about this story, and he in fact reminded me, and it's interesting that we've been talking a little bit about this already, but this idea of for fire. The word for fire in Wiradjuri is win. He then reminded me through the course of this project, and as I was trying to develop up an idea, he reminded me that the word for the word win, so just adding na on the end of the word fire, is the word for enlighten. And I was like, oh yeah, Uncle, what do you mean? Like, turn the lights on. What are you talking about? And he just laughed at me as usual, and just said, no, winna means lighten up your brain, use your imagination, think. And then he reminded me that other words are all connected to the word fire for the way Wiradjuri people think. So winonai gunana is another word for remember. So that fire is central to the way we think. It's central to our worldview. It's part of who we are. And this, of course, makes total sense. In an Aboriginal context, which we've already been talking about, fire is our friend. It was used to look after the country, encourage regrowth, build resilience. It was used to make our homes. It was used to keep our families warm and to feed us. Fire's been part of our lives for thousands of generations. It's only in recent years, really, that, and I should sort of say in contemporary sort of Western mindset, that sees fire as a foe. And I've often wondered that is it this Western mindset that has caused the memory of the Garden Palace and all the material to be completely forgotten out of Australia's history? So it was my thinking, well, not mine, but Wiradjuri thinking around fire that gave me the kind of creative foothold to start creating a work. And this was really important for me because this is that fire of the Garden Palace is often seen as a full stop at the end of the story. So the first thing to come back after a fire is bungal, is our grasses, and in particular our perennial native grasses that have quite a large seed head on them. And in fact, most of our plants, 95% of our plants in Australia rely on a cool, controlled burn. So not an out-of-control bushfire, but a very cool, usually like a winter or autumn burn that happens in small little patches across our country. And that's how our country's prospered. Communities, as seen here, have been controlled burning and regenerating and harvesting grass as part of a complex agricultural process for eons. Yet this relationship with our grass and this story of Aboriginal agriculture has long been suppressed out of the Australian national consciousness. As this notion of cultivation around our grasses, which we cultivated our grasses, we collected the seeds and we ground it into bread, to make food, really kind of challenges the very kind of legal justification of colonisation in Australia, which some of you might know as terra nullius, this idea of empty land, this idea that Aboriginal occupation didn't amount to anything. We weren't really doing farming, we weren't really engaging in Western practices, so it was empty and ripe for the taking. Yet, contrary to that popular belief, we did till the soil and we did harvest the land, and we altered watercourses on massive scale for production. It just so happens that those productions didn't destroy the landscape at the same time. Evidence is found in countless early explorers' diaries. There's one famous sort of example, which is Sir Thomas Mitchell, was the first sort of white fella to invade our lands in the southeast. And he talks about 9 miles, riding through 9 miles of kangaroo grass, a monoculture of grass, that he describes as being haycocked and hay-ricketed together. So that idea of bundling things together and putting them being out for harvested. 9 miles, that's like 18 kilometres of cultivated grasslands that have been pulled together to collect the grass and used to make bread. And I should also mention here too that if anyone's interested in researching Aboriginal agriculture more, one of our leading sort of Aboriginal academics is Bruce Pascoe, and he's been working on this really hard if anyone's interested. In addition to these early accounts, and there's countless early accounts, all those early explorers that went through Australia talk about seeing Aboriginal people in massive farming techniques, growing yams, growing grasses, looking after their country on an enormous scale, which has been completely obliterated out of our history. In addition to this, into these early accounts, we've recently found a grindstone, so a stone dish that we used to grind those seeds down to make the flour, in central New South Wales, near where my family's from, that's dated at 32,000 years old. And so that dish of 32,000 years old, making bread, makes Aboriginal Australians the oldest bread makers in the world, predating the Egyptians by 15,000 years. Which is a pretty extraordinary kind of claim to make, but of course no Australian is aware of that at all and is predominantly uninterested in it. This idea of world first sits very comfortably within the Aboriginal worldview. Just in the southeast alone, we have the world's oldest ceremonial burial at 30,000 years. We have the world's oldest man-made structure, which is a fish trap, a stone fish trap, in the Barker River in western New South Wales. Yet, as I said, all this knowledge has been written out of Australia's history. We're constantly told every day that when you look at Australian national history, that we're a young country, not the home of the world's oldest living culture. So the first part of the project, and this is the start of the artwork, the first part of the project was to challenge Australia's long-term memory loss, someone could call it willful amnesia, by reinstating Aboriginal agriculture in the Botanic Gardens. And obviously that was a direct hit to that colonial space of the Botanic Gardens, this idea of collecting native species from around the world and centralising them into this spot. We created a native meadow of kangaroo grass. So this is a kangaroo grass, which is one of those big seeded grasses that we used often. And this is a site that was usually, this site is actually underneath where the dome sat. So it's a 30-metre circle where the dome once stood. And this is a space that's usually reserved for pansies and roses and things. So we removed those ornamental plants and put in our kangaroo grass. And by placing the natives in the centre here, we were obviously trying to highlight that deep cultural connection Aboriginal people have had to country, but also asserting our industries and sovereignty. It was a very, I guess, low-key work, but it was an important statement nonetheless. The second part of the project is quite a big-scale statement regarding the work, and recognised the actual footprint of the building. Along with the footprint, it obviously acknowledged its destruction and the contents that were destroyed. So this is the actual site today, and that's that white marking is in fact the footprint of the building, and it's on the edge of the city there in the Botanic Gardens. This has been constructed out of 15,000 broad shields. Now, broad shields were sort of once dominated Southeast cultural practices. They were part of our identity. They were used in ceremonies and performances. And in fact, early documentation shows that on this site, local Sydney people, Gadigal people, used this site as one of these performances. And some of those early drawings show men with their shields. However, for the work, we made the shields out of gypsum. And gypsum's a material that we use in the southeast as part of our mourning ceremonies. And here you go, you get a bit of a detail of those shields. So the bleached shields, of course, spoke to, I guess, the destruction of knowledge that happened on that day of the fire. The lost memories, but also that idea that knowledge is still embedded within our landscape. And in many ways, these shields gave rise to the project's title, Barango Jara, which means skin and bones. The third part of the project was looking at languages. And so languages in the southeast have recently started to make a resurgence. For a long time, people like Uncle Stan and others have held very closely to their knowledge of language, teaching people very slowly, but recently there's been a real uptake in this. And if anything, I think it's been starting to demonstrate the extraordinary resilience of Aboriginal communities. For the project, we ended up approaching 8 different language groups who we know had material in the building and suffered an extraordinary loss when the fire went through. Some communities contributed songs, wrote songs. Some communities made stories about objects. Some who were at very early stages of their language simply gave word lists in language. And I was just going to play a small sample of some of those soundscapes now. I should just mention that the photos don't match the sound sometimes, but the first soundscape is the Sydney language, the Gadigal language, which hadn't been spoken for 200 years. So the project invested enormously in developing local community knowledge around their language and building those skills up. The second one is Auntie Vicky Cousins singing about possum skin cloaks. We used to make cloaks. The third one is the Gamilaroi language, which is the language of my grandfather, which I never got to hear. And it's a group of really young little school kids calling out the words of lost objects, and we've made them sound like birds. And the last one is in Wiradjuri, which you hear people describing words like Winonai Gunana Garan Garan Maran Ran, which is remember the designs on the shields. So I'll just play those now for us.
Garajan. Garajan. Bira. Bira. Namol. Namol. Mulgulnia. Mulgulnia. Muting. Muting. Nawi. Nawi. Gunyi. Gunyi.
Marawan bamakurumuk, Marawan bamakurumuk, Marawan bamakurumuk, Marawan bamakurumuk. Tanambul kapamit purut, Tanambul kapamit purut, Tanambul kapamit purut, Tanambul kapamit purut.
Gane, Gudwa, Manga, Dundu, Baron, Baron, Bila, Bera, Bingu, Bingu, Bundi, Bundi, Bandu, Bandua, Burin, Bowen, Gane, Gane, Gudura, Gudura, Manga, Manga, Yundu, Yundu, Baron, 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 Bingu, Bila, Bera, Bundi, Bingu, Bandura, Burin, Bandu, Gane, Burin, Bowen, Gudura, Gane, Gane, Manga, Gudura, Manga, Manga, Yundu.
Winang nai gunana wangara nani guliala ganai.
Winang nai gunana ganai.
Winang nai gunana ugil birandi badam.
Winang nai gunana badam.
Winang nai gunana murura giran giran.
Winang nai gunana giran giran.
So that last one was the Wiradjuri one. That was my Uncle Stan saying Winonai Gunana, inviting us all to remember. And I guess what we were really interested in with this project is as you moved around the space, there was those shields marking the footprint, that sort of central zone of the grass. And as you moved around, there were these 8 soundscapes, which really filled the landscape with these words. And we were really interested in, obviously, promoting language, but what we really learned from language is that nothing's ever lost. You know, so even though we don't have those objects to hold, we don't have those objects to learn from, if we can speak them, we'll always remember them. They'll always be in our hearts. And that was really kind of, I guess, the key idea behind working with those languages. Finally, like the Garden Palace before it, the project became a stage for public programs and public engagement. The landscape, in fact, became this site of conversations, and a collection of performances, talks, took place over the 2 weeks that the project was on. And one of the key processes for the project, which we worked really hard on, was engaging a whole group of young Aboriginal guides. So there was no labelling around at all. There was no text, there was no fonts. It was all about people coming onto the site, and they would be greeted by a young Aboriginal person and guided around and talked to. And of course, this project was using the power of oral history and that engagement with people. Because in so many ways, all this knowledge is out there in books, but what we were finding was that people need to talk to someone and hear their experiences. This was extraordinarily taxing on those young ones who were there every day, telling these stories and engaging with people. Every day we had to debrief and unpack what was talked about, which was really powerful. But it was an extraordinary moment when, over those two-week periods, hundreds of thousands of people came through the space and engaged with young Aboriginal people, sharing their stories and exchanging knowledge. One of the key projects, which was the outcomes, which I'll just mention really quickly, was Bangarra Dance Company. And Bangarra is probably one of the leading Aboriginal dance groups. And they created a new work for the project. And so the night of the fire, the anniversary of the fire, they did this extraordinary performance moving through the artwork, dancing with the objects. So in conclusion, I guess I was keen to sort of remind us what Uncle Stan taught me, which was that we should never let go of our worldviews. Things like fire and understanding what fire means for us is central to how we move forward. Our worldviews have made us the world's oldest living culture, and if we let them, they can continue to guide us and create new cultural ideas and new pathways, even in today's sort of colonial spaces. What was extraordinary about this project is that this project not only reminded Aboriginal communities through our worldviews of our history, but it also engaged the broader Australian community as well. And I think that that was one of the key sort of turning points, this idea that Aboriginal worldviews and Aboriginal ways of seeing the landscape can actually reactivate memories for everyone, and kind of share a new knowledge that can be imparted to across all Australians, which was kind of the central idea of the project. So I might just finish there. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Jonathan. If I could ask our final panelists to come up and join us for the discussion, that would be wonderful. I'm just going to read out who they are. So Geir Tore Holm is an artist and educator concerned with the interaction between people and the environment, agriculture and life. Carola Grahn, who is actually going to talk but also moderate afterwards the discussion, is an artist who constructs and deconstructs social relations in an attempt to understand, given roles, how they relate to the individual self-image and at the same time influence society. Raven Chacon is a composer, performer, and installation artist based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's also a member of the indigenous art collective Post Commodity. Duane Linklater is an artist whose work explores the structural language of an institution and space, as well as excavates histories to unearth folds and knots addressing cultural loss, recovery, and sovereignty. And Anders and Jonathan, of course, who you know. So I'll let the conversation flow.
Okay. Hey. There's so many ways to start such a panel discussion. And I've been listening today and like kind of changed the way I want to enter, because there's like so many perspectives, right? And I think we've heard a little bit about it. I mean, it got pretty heated when Duane started to show the really, really, I think, crucial, hard questions. And I want to start this conversation. I'm also, as I think that question came from, is like power, right? I'm so interested in power also, and the power dynamics and how it comes down to really small details. And, and that is it has to do with knowledge. And I want to thank Oka for inviting me, and also for giving me the power to take over their web space, because right now they have no web page. Oka doesn't have a web page for 48 hours. It's not much, but at least it's 48 hours. They've given it to me as an indigenous female artist to just do basically whatever I want. And this is what I've done. And there's a lot of ways to look at this, and I hope you can see it in your phones for the next 48 hours, so please do that later if you're interested. But what is also so fantastic, I think, is that we're only indigenous people up here. And why is that fantastic? It's fantastic because for once, I'm not put in the position where I have to represent all of those guys and all of the people back home, right? We can actually say different things. And I have like 2 Sami colleagues here who can actually also say stuff about our culture, which is also diverse, but also much the same in a way. I mean, it's all which kind of perspective I choose to have. And adding to that, I also want to say I am a woman. And it's obvious I'm the only one here, right, on the panel. And that is also power and lack of power. So I want you to acknowledge that we're not only indigenous, and feminism and being a woman is a big part of who I am and in my everyday life. I am also very, very rich. I mean, not richer than probably most of you in here, but compared to a lot of colleagues, indigenous artists who are not here, who doesn't have the economy that we have in Scandinavia. That is also another perspective, right, to have. Also, you might notice I have white privilege. And that's something that is very getting more clear to me as I now live in New York, where there's a great Black movement with great scholars and so much inspiration of where I get also to learn to see what I have and what I don't have. So I hope today we're not only going to be the poor indigenous artist who's never going to be in the museum. I mean, we're more than that. And I think that's a good, starting point for us. So I'm saying that also to you as my colleague, right? But we are also here because we're going to talk about indigenous issues. And just so to getting to know you, I wanted to start to ask you, how many in here knows how to say thank you in Sami, any of the Sami languages? Raise your hand. Okay, that's less than half. And we are in Norway. I think that's fascinating. I think in Sweden, we wouldn't have this many people raising their hands at all. It says now something about power and knowledge, doesn't it? Also, I wanted to ask how many in here understands how unique and radical it is that Uka is doing this in Oslo today. Oh, yeah, a little bit maybe. You're here, right? There's a lot of people who's not here. Because I just want to say that it is radical because, well, I was so surprised to see one Swede here today, actually. Because in Sweden, and I think I'm also talking about Norway, saying this, Sami issues, whatever they're about, it's like, what? Or like, aha. It's not, it doesn't generate anything, really. It's just like, oh. Or like, ugh. It's nothing more behind that. Because there's a lack of knowledge, a lack of interest. Because also, if you don't know so much about it, what really can you be interested in? So when I got the invitation to come here today, I was like, blown away. I was like, what? Oh God, really? Doing this? What? And for the whole year, focusing on those questions. I think it's important as a Norwegian privileged person, that I would say most Norwegians are, as Swedish people where I grew up, to realize how little we know about the indigenous people in our country. And in the art world, as an example, 2 years ago, so I emailed the Moderna Museet in Stockholm asking, do you have anything in your collection by Sami artists? I got the reply, oh, we don't categorize that way. So we don't know. Okay, so I took all the names of my colleagues, every indigenous artist I could come up with. Some I even would think is more designers, but I put them in anyway. And I said, do you have anything of any one of those? And I got back, no, we don't. And they don't care still today, because they don't know to care, I guess, or at all. So that is putting the platform of being here today with those great, great artists. I also want to acknowledge that it's a difference also. Even though we have a lot of in common, I believe there's different situations in Canada and in Australia and so. And I would like us to try to be complex now. When we have the chance among ourselves to have this discussion or talk, let's not only say the things that I mean, with a limited space as an indigenous artist, there's certain things you have to say, because you have to kind of lay out the power dynamics or the lack of knowledge and so, to be able to actually come to a more maybe deeper or complex discussion. But I mean, we've had that today, right? We've had a lot of, we know now, if you've been here all day at least, a lot of things. So I think we can actually, hopefully, even go beyond that. My first question to the panel is, please explain decolonization to us from your perspective. Because I know in Sweden there's that word, I think I've only heard Sami people say it, because colonization, Sweden? No. So please talk about how you, and I've heard earlier some thoughts that I think could be interesting. So please elaborate on that and what do you think of the word or term or so.
Okay, I'll start. That's fine. My name is Duane. I'm a Moose Cree person from Northern Ontario. Decolonization. This word has surfaced, I think, within a North American context, particularly within the past 5 or 6 years. Gerald mentioned earlier Idle No More. I think with the ascension of that particular movement in around 2012, 2013, this word sort of came along with it. Which immediately, to be quite honest, about this specific word, when I see words like that rise quickly to discourse, people say them with high frequency, say them again and again and again. I was very skeptical of it as a word, it as an idea, and I still remain skeptical about its implementation and what it is. I think that part of it was how it sort of ascended in Canada in particular. All of a sudden it was just sort of appeared. And everybody was talking about it, but maybe not really knowing what it actually does or means. The meaning was not clear to me. And the meaning of it still, there's no clarity for me for that word. I know what colonization is because I've felt it. It's happened on myself, and it's happened on my family directly, violently. I know what that is. I can define that specifically, colonization, from my position as a Omuskego and Inuit person from where I come from. I can describe that. But how can I imagine to describe the decolonization? Not yet.
I was at Indigenous New York a couple of weeks ago, and there was a really great Indigenous woman who I don't remember the name of, but she said that once when she was in a panel like this, she was interrupted by an elder Indigenous woman who said, "Who are you?" And I realize now that's crucial for being invited to a conversation. And some of us haven't been on stage today. So actually, before we continue that, maybe we should say our names and just very briefly who we are.
I'm Geir Tore Holm.
I'm Raven Chacon.
Please also say your relation to the indigenous.
I'm a Sami.
And I'm Navajo and Chicano from the Southwest U.S.
Yeah. I'm Duane, and I live in North Bay. I'd hate to say it, it's Canada. But I am a Muskego and Inuit person.
Yeah, and my name is Sunna, and I'm a Sami, and yeah.
Okay, I've got to go again. Jonathan, I'm from Australia, so Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi are the two sort of nations from my family.
And I'm Carola Grahn, and I'm Sami from the Sweden. I'm actually South Sami, from the Swedish side of Sápmi. Okay. Could any of you others respond on that decolonization one?
Okay. Yeah. On purpose, I sat down here on this chair because I was so inspired by Anders' comment on the darkness, or the explanation of the darkness here. So I wanted to sit in the darkness. It feels okay still. I'm from a place not far away from Anders' home area, but I'm from the Atlantic side of it. I'm from the sea on the coast, in the continuation of the valley Anders comes from, on the Norwegian side. So what I thought about this darkness, because I almost said I'm addicted to light. I sometimes call myself, as we Sami people do, I'm a son or a child of the sun. So I started to think, oh yeah, that's a good idea about darkness. So I started to think, what could we achieve from the darkness? What could be fruitful with the darkness? Because all these notions and the buildings that the institutions and that the museums are, they are making shadows. I could see it from Gerald's presentation, all these big buildings, how much they were making shadows. And that's a challenge, all this shadow. Because I think I also started to think about museum, the word museum, which must come from the word muse. I don't know the correct in English, muse. It's kind of deities, these kind of goddesses inspiring us. So that must be the etymology of that, of the word museum. So they are somehow the basic idea of the museum must be an ancient or antique idea about a place to be inspired by some kind of goddesses. And I think that's to consider today as well, even though I see that the museum's main role, or they are tools for power. So they are part of a power, they are parts or part of different power regimes. And that I find interesting to discuss when we want to burn them down, as we could do here, because with inspiration from Kazimir Malevich, that wanted to make the museum's collections into ashes. So why should we burn the museums today? I'm a little bit skeptical to such acts because I'm concerned about the use of materials, and we use so much materials today, and we should recycle more. That's my concept. But if you're going to recycle the museums, we have to recycle the ideas about the museums too, the concepts that are kind of embedded in the history of the museums. So I think we should put them into another we should use the term recycle to put the museums into other cycles, not to recycle like in one cycle, but to make new cycles. And I think that museum, or those museums, they are museums not on fire, but with fire. Yeah.
Same question.
If you like. I also like that if you have something else you want to say, just do it.
Well, almost every panel I sit on, that question gets asked. What do you think of decolonization? So it's almost becoming a thing, a trope. And I never answer it because I don't know what the hell decolonization means. But I'll try to answer it today. I'm very skeptical of the word too, like Duane. The reason why is I've never known what it meant. The best way I've seen it confronted was somebody had a Facebook post. Maybe it was even Raymond Boisjoli or some instigator like that. Said, how do you say decolonization in your language, in your indigenous language? And nobody had a word for it. So I don't know what it means, you know. And wouldn't that be the first step to decolonizing, is figuring out a word for that in your own language or making a new one? So I don't know what it means, but the reason I'm skeptical is that, again, something that Duane said, and leading into what Geir said, is that the colonizing process has been a very deliberate system imposed on the indigenous people, and a very calculated system. And when people say they're decolonizing something, decolonizing food, or decolonizing art, or decolonizing whatever, that's always talked about like it's an individual responsibility. When if we're to undo something, maybe it has to become a group or tribal system that we develop to do this collectively. The other reason I'm skeptical is when I say we're untangling this or undoing it, that's some kind of retrograde, in that we're going to be recessing backwards. To me, that's what it would feel like, as if we're not propelling ourselves forward, thinking up that new word in our own languages about what that could be. Instead, we're trying to search for some word in the past that doesn't exist. And so I'm skeptical of the ideas of that we're supposed to get back to something. Because where does that put artists, indigenous artists? When we get back to this place we believe we're supposed to be back to, will we weird artists be accepted in that place? And so I'm completely skeptical of any time that word is used.
We don't all have to answer if we don't feel like, but if you want to.
Yeah, maybe I'm not the man with many words, but okay. It's quite. It's not so far ago I heard the word decolonization, but when I'm looking back with my family and how I grew up, I noticed that maybe they were decolonized because they never listened to the system, they never followed the rules, and they have never done that since almost 50 years now. And we have been out the system for 50 years. So when I'm thinking back and my childhood and stuff like that, I noticed that I think I'm more free than everyone else. I was allowed to do whatever I want. We didn't follow any system at all. My parents didn't encourage us to follow law and order, because even the government didn't follow their own law and orders. So we were really free in our childhood, and my parents also, that yeah, do what you want. Don't listen to the system because, yeah, it's made up. So, yeah, I'm feeling quite free anyway. So, yeah.
Well, I used the word. Ugh, now I'm in trouble. You guys are so skeptical. You guys need to lighten up anyway. I guess it's a. I think in this context, in an international context, the word decolonization is helpful for capturing a whole bunch of ways Indigenous people think. And I do think that, you know, when you do go back to communities and listen to people, there are, like, you know, different, you know, Indigenous ways of doing, seeing and thinking about the world. And I think they form part of a process of unpacking the colonial project. You know, I would challenge and say, like, is there an Indigenous word for colonization? So, you know, like we, you know, we need to take on. I mean, we're part of these systems now, and we are, you know, we are all engaged in this process of unpacking them or dealing with them or thinking about them, and not just letting them roll over us. So we can either be the sort of passive people, which we're not, and none of us are. I would argue that everyone sitting here is obviously not passively taking any of this, and we're part of that process. And I just think it's like, I guess not, maybe you guys are saying it's not a helpful label, but I think in one way it helps to kind of put a circle around it in some way. I don't know, corral it in some sort.
I agree with you. I guess part of that deliberate decision to problematize that word, to hopefully generate this kind of a discussion about what it is or what it isn't. Part of what is being circumscribed today by yourself and what the Indigenous people are saying here, part of what's being circumscribed and talked about, I think, are these spaces of us that are not colonized, that were unbreached by colonization. So for me, this is the part that I like to think about and look at and talk about. Like how you say you're free. I believe you, right? And how you talk about caribou or reindeer and your relationship today and darkness. To me, that's articulating a kind of indigeneity or Saminness that was not breached by the state, right? So for those are the things that, and I think each and everybody here sitting here and the Indigenous people that have come to speak talk about those spaces. They articulate those spaces that were not breached by colonization. So for me, it's important to propose to each other internationally in North America context to maybe think about those spaces. Because in your projects as well, there was something that you pulled out of this very, very tragic thing. Even for me to listen to you say it was hard, I sensed that too. So it's important for you to pull something out of this space. The importance, and this is a problematic word to use, the way in which that your people used fire as a kind of a technology, right? There's all of this knowledge around it, and they knew how to use it in a very specific way in which that not only do humans benefit from, but like the whole system, right? So like you're saying, bread is like 40,000 years old. That kind of knowledge about fire is probably even deeper, right? It's just built and built and built and built and built and built. So for me, that's like this, your way to think about fire and think about it and articulate it in the way that you did is what I'm talking about in terms of thinking about an unbreachable space of who you are.
Okay. I also want to answer that question, and I think I did a little bit, maybe posing it, because I think the word decolonization kind of made me realize that there's colonization in Sweden, and now living in America, how people talk about Sweden there is amazing. They think it's heaven. They think we're so equal, and as a Sami person, it just makes me so frustrated, like, because I have to know my history, I have to argue, I have to kind of tell my story to also about the country I live in and my culture. So decolonization as a word, it's also annoying. So I love that we have those different perspectives. But every time I use it in Sweden, it feels so loaded because I'm at the same time saying I'm colonized, or Sweden has colonized my culture. So, and which is not, I have almost never heard a non-Sami person in Sweden use that word, because it's not in the national identity that we've colonized. We were like not in the war, like it's not in the story about Sweden. So it's not in the identity of Swedish people. And so every time I say decolonize, it's like I kind of feel how the person non-indigenous is like, ooh, like, oh, don't put that heavy baggage on me, like as if a black person acknowledged that I'm white in a situation where that matters. It's not so nice to know in a way, like, but important. Next question. I want to say because we're all here, also international. I think I'm guessing you guys also travel to have shows and so we have a quite interesting perspective, both being global, but then also having this really strong connection and love for our communities and cultures. And then I just want to say simply, what's the problem with museums? And then please be detailed, please tell anecdotes of when a museum has approached you and it was just, from your perspective, wicked or even dumb.
Some museum stories. I often have been, when I'm invited to an exhibition somewhere, not necessarily museums, but maybe art centers, and differ so much, but I often try to build my own. I used to, especially earlier, to build my own dwelling in the museums, like my protected space or some indoor house or a kitchen or a place to be protected from the environment. And that has been a kind of strategy coming to the museums, like making myself at home somehow. And cleaning a little bit and looking around. So
I'm taking notes.
Yeah, and also talking to the technicians, the people that are not in charge, and having coffee and that has been a part of my way of doing things, and also being slow.
I'm not trying to be contrarian. I mean, I don't always consider myself an artist either. I'm a musician first and foremost, and I got into art somehow. But my relationships with museums are kind of different. When the music or sound works I was making did start becoming, something that was able to be presented in an art context, the museums were the only place that would happen. my work isn't commercial by any means, and there's no gallery that would be, showing this. I don't, have a gallery for my solo work. And for a long time, post-commodity, it was the same way, where we don't make tangible objects. We don't make, and you have to understand, we live in the Southwest. Santa Fe is, if we're not making turquoise jewelry, we're not being exhibited. Nobody knows what a sound installation is in New Mexico until some of us started doing it, and Arizona and anywhere, and so we're not painters, and we're not we don't have the craft that our fellow indigenous artists have in that region. So the museums were the only place to show this stuff, or they were the only ones who would take a chance on us sometimes. So in that way, I have to acknowledge that, because I wouldn't be sitting here today if I wasn't able to have an exhibition history due to that. And some of these institutions have taken big risks in showing our work, and for a long time we hadn't sold any works. We're not in that field. That's we do a different kind of work that isn't always able to be presented in a lot of the institutions in the United States. We also don't have the kind of funds that you might see in Canada, though we've had great support in Canada. That's a totally different story. But a museum story, I guess I got one. I could tell because Gerald McMaster is here and Jonathan Jones, and it was a piece that my collective Post-Commodity did in the Sydney Biennial in 2012 that was co-curated by Gerald. And he invited us to restage our piece called Do You Remember When?, in which we cut a 4-foot by 4-foot hole out of the floor of the museum. We did it first in the Arizona State University Art Museum, and Gerald invited us to do it in the Gallery of New South Wales in Sydney, which is that's the oldest art institution, surviving art institution in Australia. Is that correct? And so we were excited to do that. Of course, we have to do it on the lowest level. We can't cut a hole in the floor and then it'd be like on the second or third floor. That'd be funny. But so we went down the basement, and we learned that that's where they put all the Aboriginal artists, is in the basement. You can't even tell there's anything down there. There's escalators, and then there's a sign for the bathroom and the coat check maybe. And then we learned that that's where all the Aboriginal artists are relegated to. So we were happy to be able to present in that space, even though logistically that was the only place we could do it. But that piece is funny. This has happened twice. It's probably a little bit naive on our part, but after we cut the hole out of the floor and put it up, it's been referred to as a scalp by people who do these reviews. But at the end of the day, we want to keep our trophy of cutting the hole out of the floor. And both times the institution say, no, that's our floor. Put it back. You don't own that. And that's what the piece is about. Who owns this land that we're exposing, or who owns your concrete? So we're still naive, and we had to put it back and give it back to them. But we smuggled out 4 pieces of the oldest art institution in Australia, with the help of somebody here on the panel here. So, and maybe we'll put those up for sale. Yeah.
It's a good story. So I decided to be an artist in 2009 for real. I told myself I'm going to do this in full, inhabit the role of being an artist. And I should say that I like when artists question that identity. And so I appreciate that. So as I began to negotiate the system of being an artist and making exhibitions in artist-run centers, museums, commercial galleries, university galleries, I found that I would make assessments of certain things. I would make observations about my time in the museum itself and start to ask questions about the museum. Many different kinds of questions. One of the primary generative questions I asked of myself and asking of the museum and the people who work there and the people who speak for the museum is, who came here to work before I did? Which indigenous artist? That's an important question for me to ask of myself. That's an important question to propose to the institution. For me, it somehow seems very important to know about the particular indigenous art history within these spaces. And as I said earlier, that the history is sparse in Canada at these institutions that I just mentioned. So, but it's important to ask that question to myself and ask that question to the museum as well, to the institution. Also, another important question that I ask myself when I'm in the space is, what have I implicated myself into? I think it's important to ask that as an indigenous artist. The sort of problem of being indigenous and being in a space like this. And, you know, there are some very direct material responses that are present. And I think this exhibition in particular has articulated some of that. That I quite appreciate the trees in here a great deal. For me, that speaks to questions of what is the museum made out of in material. Concrete is an aggregate of stone. The walls are usually made out of gypsum. Drywall, that's from the ground. Wood is from trees. The steel at some point was mined. So I asked those kinds of questions of the museum, the material questions. What are you made out of? Those are some of the responses. But it's much more complex than that. Who lived by these things? Who lived by the gypsum? Who lived by the trees? Who lived by the aggregate, by the stones, by the water? Who lived by those places? Often on the periphery, it's indigenous people. When those resources are extracted from those spaces, from the periphery, who at the edges feels that power? Indigenous people do. Right? There's a mine in northern Ontario, I believe it was a pulp and paper mill. And this particular company in the 1940s and 50s in this community called Grassy Narrows, they left their entire operation. They abandoned this space and dumped mercury into the system. Subsequently, I know very little about mercury, but I know once it's put into a system, it stays there. And it accumulates over generations. So if these indigenous people at that edge are consuming the fish, which they do, are consuming the animals, which consume the fish, are part of this network of system of animals and grass and beings and things, they're in this system. So it's important to think about those spaces of extraction, of where these materials come from. For me, anyways. That was the question that I had to ask myself, what is the problem of the museum? And then asking myself, what have I implicated myself into?
Okay. Yeah. Okay, when I'm going to museums or exhibitions, I like to take over the place and make it to my own home and feeling comfortable. At the first time I was quite alone with exhibitions and traveling around, and then I'm starting a project, Matue. In South Sami it means heritage. With a friend from, he is Swedish, Dutch background. So now we're traveling quite much together and building the whole exhibitions by ourselves. We went to build the walls by ourselves, hanging up and creating everything in this museum. And we also have like a program for the guide the people that showing they can have a program that this is what we want to say and this is what you can show and telling our story when we are not there. And when we are walking around and making ourselves comfortable, sometimes we find a sauna in a museum, and I think that was really good experience because it's not often you can find a sauna in a museum, and we were there like every day when we were finished our job, so we used it really much that time. And also when we are working, we are taking music in the area and taking over the place also with sounds when we were working. And one time, I think it was last summer, one of the bosses came and took our speaker and put it in the freezer because it was sounding too much and he didn't like the music. And this was in Norway, and stuff like that. So it's all about taking place, and not that you can, this is your place, don't go any further than that. And that just making me curious that, I want to go further because I want to know what you have there. So, yeah, I don't know.
There was one time, I'm sure all of it, like going to museums, researching. I spend, all of us probably spend way too much time in museums. I do remember, though, there was a day that I realized what the museum storeroom reminded me of. And it eluded me for a really long time, but the lino floors, the sort of way things are laid out, the fluorescent lights that sort of flicker, and that sort of dull hum of the air conditioning is like hospital. It was the only other place I'd experienced that crappy linoleum floor, those lights, those sort of conditions reminded me of visiting family in hospital. And I don't know, that was just, it's always stuck with me that it's those two spaces, are almost identical to me. Yeah.
And my strategy is to go big. Just as an example, when doing this web page, my suggestion was also to project it on the Opera House. So that's my strategy, trying to, both as a woman, I think, and an indigenous person, just seeing how big, how much will they allow me to, how much space can I take over. Thank you. I'm really inspired by all of those answers. I got a note quite long ago saying, go to Q&A there's no time. So even though I think we could have a lot of interesting stuff to say, I'm also hungry, and I think you might be too. So if you have a question, just be quick. And yeah, be quick. But please, do it. There's actually 8 Sami languages, and I don't know them all, but Gitu is a good, like, the northern Sami language is the biggest, so if you know that one, it's pretty close to Finnish, thank you. Kiitos, that is,
Kiitos.
Yeah. Sorry, you know, and then, but in, where I come from, we would say Geito, or something, yeah.
I wanted just to comment on Geir Tore's mention that what he likes to do when he goes into a museum is go and speak to some of those other people who might be there, technicians, other people who are lower down the ranks of that hierarchy of that institution. It makes me think of the work of a Spanish artist called Santiago Sierra. And I can't remember which museum he did this in, but his piece was actually about lining up all of the staff of the museum. And what was extraordinary to see is the gradation of skin color as that lineup was made. So that at the very top of the line, of course, very white, and as you went down the line, the darker the skin color became. So, yeah, I think what you're doing is basically exploring those imbalances within that space.
Anyone else?
I'm just thinking about this decolonize word. Maybe it's the rest of the world that needs to deal with this. I mean, the white, Eurocentric, Western world that needs to deal with that word. Because, like each of you talk about your own experience, and you are strong, resilient, bearers, and we are many people in the world who fight also across borders and across fake borders with solidarity, with our different privileges. So maybe we can sort of throw that, put that, always the questions go to the people, you know, who need it the least. Maybe that question needs to be posed the other way around. And right now, here in Sápmi, Norway, that question should be posed to this crowd, where the major art institution heads today. I saw some of them swinging in and out, not patient enough or prioritizing to stay here till the end. Maybe they should decolonialize. Maybe they should start to also deconstruct their privileges, their nationality, or we should all do that. When I moved to the north of Norway, which I now always try to name Sápmi, I have a background as a Norwegian, and I went to school here in Oslo. We learned incredibly little about the diverse culture of the territory that Norway is on. And as a process of moving to Sápmi and the north, that has to become a sort of personal quest to learn and relearn everything and start to deconstruct and understand landscape. And if you look at animal and how they, and also weather, how nomadic it is, it doesn't have any borders. And so I think we can sort of give everybody else that task. You know, we can manage to sort of step out of our comfort zones and take that question on each of everyone, and also collectively, since the personal is political. So I think we should throw that question to those that need it the most instead of having to answer.
Thank you. Okay, I think I'll quickly then say thank you to my colleagues and to you who endured to the end. Or is it something happening right now after? Okay, but we're finished anyway.
So just a final word, if you'll allow me, just to thank everybody, the speakers, the artists, everybody who's participated in the day. Thank you for your patience, and just to remind you that there is a concert, which is free for all, at 10:30 at Ingested's, with Ella Maria Eira, who is quite phenomenal on stage, so I really recommend you. So thanks again, and come back tomorrow for the final part. Goodbye.